Imagine trying to sleep while hundreds of wounded men scream outside your bedroom window, while piles of amputated limbs sit beneath the barn you built with your own hands. Gettysburg is more than just a battlefield. It's an emotional ground soaked in grief, fear, survival, and unfinished stories. The Spangler family built their farm, and it was George and Elizabeth Spangler as the parents, and they had 4 children, all of them hardworking farmers, and lived a very peaceful life. They were very profitable. They had a lot of livestock, a lot of crops that they grew. They supplied the town with food. And then suddenly they heard cannon fire. They saw flickering lanterns. A soldier came to them, head of the medic team for the 11th Corps, and they said that they were commandeering their property for a hospital. Now they're stuck in their home. Now they hear screaming. They hear surgeons operating through the night. They see limbs outside their window. What if some of those voices never actually left? Hi, I'm Roxy, and this is the Roxy's World Adventure podcast. This is my very first episode, and I'm very excited to be here. I divided my podcast into segments because I have a lot that I want to go over, and some of the stuff is, they need to be put into different categories. This particular episode goes into the category of paranormal parks. We are going to talk about the Spangler Farm in Gettysburg. George and Elizabeth Spangler lived on this farm. They had 4 children. George had a brother, and there was another Spangler Farm. This is not that Spangler Farm that was the property that they were in the midst of the battle. Now, George's property ended up there, but that's not going to be talked about until later in the episode. His brother ended up leaving, which was very smart because his property was completely destroyed, and fleeing town. George and Elizabeth owned 166 acres. Their farm was set up as such, so they had 2 roads intersecting each other. They had a fence going through, and then they had land on both sides of the far road that was coming down. The larger section of farm involved their home, a barn, and the fence, a lot of fields where they had livestock and different crops that were growing. And then across the way, it was a building that was there, and he transformed it into a schoolhouse. So it was a small schoolhouse that was on his property, and children went there to learn. George was very active in the education field, so he was an advocate for having good education for children. So this is one of the reasons why this building was on his property and why he made it a schoolhouse. They decided that they needed to stay in the home. So while his brother ran out of town, okay, a lot of people had heard the rumors. George Spangler heard the rumors, and he was like, well, they're just rumors. Why would I leave town and abandon everything that I've worked so hard for just for rumors? Which, I mean, is valid in thinking, but also there's a lot of talk of the Confederates already being in town, and a lot of things were already coming into fruition, but they still decided to stay on the ground because they didn't know if the fighting would get to their property. Well, they ended up getting a knock on their door and being told that their home and property was being commandeered for a 11th Corps hospital. So they didn't know what to do, but they knew they had to stay because the war had already gotten to their area. They were pushed into a tiny bedroom, 1 bedroom. Now, this bedroom was about half the size of my studio. And I've been in this building, so I've seen the bedroom. 6 people in this tiny bedroom. It was, I mean, I just can't fathom it. And they weren't just there for the 3 days, right? They were there for 5 weeks. 5 weeks. Can you imagine being stuck in a room with your 6 other family members for 5 weeks and not being able to leave? That's absolutely terrifying. It's one of those things where it really is terrifying because you kind of realize that history doesn't ask permission before it changes your life. And their lives were turned upside down because of this. The 11th Corps had its issues. It was mostly Germans that were on the 11th Corps, and they were discriminated against. Some of them couldn't speak much English, and they were basically the first soldiers into battle. They were the cannon fodder, which is really unfortunate because, they're basically putting the minorities on the front lines. That's just how it was. It's really sad to think about because a lot of these soldiers on the first day, it was cut in more than half. And just to give you an idea of how many casualties, people who went missing or people who died, it was in the upwards of 50,000 people in this battle. This battle was the bloodiest battle during the Civil War. There was a bloodiest day, and that was Antietam, but this was the bloodiest battle long term. It's just very sad to see, they had to retreat as well because they were diminished so much in size that they just had to run away. The reason why they chose the Spangler barn is from what I described to you earlier. There were 2 roads that came into this farm. They were able to bring in multiple different bodies and people from different areas, and they were able to funnel from different parts of the field, which was an advantage for them. They could get people in and out quicker. The farm, it was 166 acres, so it was huge. They could have multiple people outside on the property or in the barn. They had multiple rooms in the house that they were using for surgery, and it really was the ideal place for them. It also had, they had an outhouse, they had ditches for them to relieve themselves on the property. So, it was an easy place for them to bring people. And it was close to the line of battle. So they were able to bring these people in fairly quickly. And as I said, on the first day of battle, this 11th Corps was down over half of their men. So the bodies that were flooding the property, it was just absolutely insane. There were a couple of people that came in on the first day that I wanted to mention. One was one of the drummers. His name was Thaddeus Reynolds. There was also Corporal John B. Thomas and Assistant Surgeon William S. Moore. Thaddeus Reynolds was only 19 years old. He was shot in the hand and in the hip, and he died within a few days. Sadly, his family had to come after and find out about his death. Corporal John B. Thomas was shot 6 times. He was shot in the finger, in both arms, in both legs, and in the chest. And he died weeks later, but he still passed away from his injuries, probably from infection, and we'll get into that later. But then Assistant Surgeon William S. Moore was shot, and he was brought in upon request. So he had gotten shot trying to pick up bodies and bring them to hospitals that were around. And actually on the other side of the property, that schoolhouse became a hospital as well. But they got rushed out because the battle ended up coming straight into their property. And he was over on that side, but he got shot. And he requested one of the surgeons that was over at the Spangler Farm on the house side. And he died on July 6th. He only died a few days later. his injuries were pretty fatal. I will go into how the medicine was set up because it's not like it is today. It was much less sophisticated. They didn't even have sanitizer. They didn't have anything to wear, like gloves, masks. They were doing it all raw. They couldn't clean. They didn't have enough time because there were so many bodies that they couldn't clean their amputation supplies before having the next amputation. So there was cross-contamination of blood. And they mostly did amputations, but that wasn't out of incompetence. The weapons that they were shooting, they shot these mini balls, is what they were called. Once they hit your body, they kind of shattered and sent lead through your body. Lead is a toxin. Therefore, these were designed to kill. The amputations would cut off that supply of lead wherever it was. So if it was in the finger and you got your finger chopped off, okay, well, it's just your finger. You're not really losing a lot. But some of these people were getting full amputations of legs, arms. Some got shot in the body. And it was only a matter of time. That's pretty fatal unless they can get everything out, which didn't usually happen, and they ended up dying. The limbs, it was 50-50 because you could chop off a limb, but they could still get infected because they didn't have sanitizer. They could die from cross-contamination of blood. They could die for many reasons. Dehydration. There was a lot that people were passing away from. It wasn't just dying from the wounds that were in battle. A lot of the times it was from what happened afterwards. A lot of these soldiers were relieving themselves anywhere that they could find. And when the rains came, guess where all of that went? A lot of them were sitting in other people's excrement for days. So just to go into everything, that's legitimately how it was. These surgeons working across the clock because they didn't have enough people to really volunteer to really help with the scenario, and they couldn't bring in people from outside because once the battle started, they couldn't bring anybody in until the battle was over. So it took days for any new surgeons, nurses, anybody else to come in, which eventually they did, but it still took weeks for them to clean everything up and get everything out of there. Could you imagine being one of those kids in that room and just looking out the window and seeing piles of limbs outside your door? They didn't have anywhere to bring the limbs, so they were shoveling them into wheelbarrows and trying to bury them wherever they could. But they were running out of land on the property too. It was just getting to be a big disaster. They had about 3 people in every surgery room. So there was a surgeon, of course, and he was always a medical expert. I say he because the surgeon was always a male. There was a person that was performing the anesthesia, which was in the form of chloroform. Now, these people were not always medical experts. Some of them were volunteers that were in battle that got minor injuries and couldn't fight anymore, and therefore they volunteered to help. And a lot of them didn't know how to perform with chloroform. And therefore, some people did die from excess amounts of chloroform. And that was unfortunate. An unfortunate lesson for these people who were volunteering just to try to help clear out people that needed surgeries. And this was just an emotionally exhausting time for the surgeons. And then the last people that were in the rooms were normally nurses, orderlies, someone to hold down the person during surgery, which that sounds like it was pretty bad, not for the best. It was not the best time for whoever was getting the surgery. And the equipment they were using was not very sharp. It took a while. Usually they would take about 15 to 20 minutes, but you're applying chloroform, then you're holding the person down, then you're sawing into them. Then you're applying the bandages, And then you're telling them go, and literally the next person is brought in. So you don't have time to wash your hands. You don't have time to eat. You don't have time to do anything. And some of these surgeons were working 24 hours. So they weren't getting any sleep. And it was just not a good scenario for anybody. I mean, it wasn't just a battlefield. It was an organized human suffering. On day 3, the battle came to the farm. The fighting was near Powers Hill. It came to the opposite side of the property, and shells were coming through. There was still gunfire that was coming towards the building. A lot of these people were running and hiding because shells were landing on their operating tables. It was pretty wild. And soldiers were just laying out in the field. Like anyone could have gotten shot. Could you imagine going through surgery, surviving surgery, getting out, like just getting shot in the finger, right? Getting out and sitting outside, and all of a sudden shells are flying around you? That's terrifying. You were surviving, but you still weren't safe. And not only that, but you were seeing, all of the crops were destroyed. The family that was up in the bedroom was hearing all of this too. All of their animals were slaughtered. Like they were taking all of their resources on the farm for the troops. And it's wild I was reading the book about it, and they didn't get even a quarter of their compensation for this back from the government, which is just wild to me. I feel like today a lot of people have insurance now, which that goes hand in hand with everything, but not getting compensated when they were told that they were going to have some sort of compensation. So I guess they did say they would have some sort of compensation, but still, I mean, getting pennies when you're supposed to, you built up your farm for years and you stayed on the property to make sure everything was okay. And all of a sudden it's like everything legitimately destroyed and you're only getting pennies back. God, it breaks my heart for these people, these poor people that were in an unfortunate circumstance. There was a famous death that was of Brigadier General Louis Armistead, and he headed Pickett's charge. He was leading the Confederates. So this was one of the only Confederates that were allowed on the Union 11th Corps, this farm. And he led Pickett's charge, and he was shot fatally, but ended up surviving for a while on the property. And some believe that he was able to be there because of his friendship with General Hancock. Now, General Hancock was on the Union side. I'm going to rewind for a second. So they were friends from childhood, and their families were friends. They would hang out all the time, and unfortunately, they both had different beliefs about the war. Unfortunately, when Hancock got the call to be a general on the Union side, they spent their last night together, and they drank and celebrated, and they said goodbye to each other. They never saw each other again, mostly because they had both gotten injured. Hancock, not as bad. I think his was very minor. But they both, when they were in their respective makeshift hospitals, they asked about each other. Could you imagine? Basically being brothers and having to fight each other. Gettysburg wasn't just brothers against brothers. It was humanity tearing itself apart. There was this one nurse, she was my favorite to read about, Rebecca Price. She had so much compassion for these soldiers. And so a lot of them, she couldn't even understand. So this really goes into not being able to hear these soldiers. They weren't able to speak English. So some of them died with their last words never really being understood because Rebecca didn't understand German, which is really unfortunate and sad. But Rebecca Price was just a wonderful human being. She's very compassionate towards all of the soldiers. She would even go as far as to replace their coat with her own pillow if they were resting their head. And this goes into the story about Joseph Heaney. He was a young boy, and she kind of took a liking to him in the fact that she felt like kind of a motherly presence to him, and he was looking for his mother. So she would comfort him, and, the days would go by. He would write letters to his family. They would write letters back, and she would write his letters out for him and read their letters to him. And in his last few hours, she held him and sang to him and led him into his last breathing moments. And she's such an angel for doing that. And this goes right back into the emotional toll. I mean, for all of them and the volunteers that didn't know how to administrate chloroform, the surgeons working 24 to 48 hours a day sometimes, the nurses comforting, and the families were searching for their loved ones. On day 4, it was July 4th, storms came in, and the soldiers that were out there were soaked, and they were sitting in excrement that was washed under them. This is just the stuff that happens afterwards. And the surgeries continued afterwards as well, because they were still bringing bodies of soldiers off the field after the battle had ended, after day 3. As I said, this was still going on for 5 weeks afterwards, and it didn't end there. I mean, then you had to deal with all of the infection, all of the blood, all of the excrement that was going into the water supply that was coming out of the wells that the town used. So they didn't have clean water for a long time until they could figure out what to do with it. This is the things that people don't think about. People mostly think about the battle. The healing doesn't happen immediately after the battle ends. Those are the things that people don't remember. People don't remember that it took forever for the town to recover after the battle. Just like it takes forever for a town to recover after a natural disaster happens. It's the same thing, except it's humanity that caused it. Now, today on the farm, there's paranormal claims. Now, I believe it. I haven't seen it on this property. I've seen it in Gettysburg, but I haven't seen it on this property, mostly because I went during the day and it was kind of walking through the house and seeing everything that was around. So I didn't really get the full experience, which I hope to someday. I would love to go and stay on the property because I'm into that sort of thing. I mean, maybe you can join me, but on the property, there's reports of phantom screams, disembodied voices, apparitions. People see soldiers. People see Armistead. There's surgical smells, which you can only imagine. That's pretty disgusting. And feelings of dread. Now, I felt the feelings of dread, not inside the barn, which is what most people say is where they occur. But I mostly felt it inside the house. And I think that was mostly in the upstairs bedroom where the family was staying. And I really felt it up there to the point where I just kind of stayed there for a while because I wanted to feel the feelings that they were feeling, I guess. And it was very powerful. Intense suffering is usually the center of where ghost stories are. So just like Gettysburg, for example, or Antietam, both of them are highly haunted places. There's usually hauntings in graveyards, cemeteries, old psychiatric hospitals, old hospitals, any kind of forts, places like that. There's always a ghost story there. But a lot of people suffered there. And maybe places remember pain. Maybe energy never fully disappears. Or maybe when thousands of people suffer in one place, part of them never truly leaves. If the walls of the Spangler Farm could talk today, would we actually want to hear what they still remember? This concludes the episode. follow Roxy's World Adventures for more stories where history, travel, healing, and the unexplained collide. Explore on.